My son texted me, "Dad, do not come to the wedding tomorrow. Vanessa does not want to explain your work clothes to her family. Just wire the remaining venue balance." I did not argue. I did not call him. I simply logged into his accounts and erased his financial existence. The next morning, they were at my doorstep demanding answers. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. I stood in my home office, the only light coming from the small desk lamp, illuminating the piece of paper in my hand. It was an invoice from a florist downtown, $82,000 for imported orchids and custom arches. I was supposed to pay it today. My phone vibrated against the solid oak of my desk. I picked it up. It was a text from my son, Connor. The message was brief. "Dad, do not come to the wedding tomorrow. Vanessa does not want to explain your work clothes to her family. Just wire the remaining venue balance." I stared at the screen. I looked down at my hands. They were rough, scarred, calloused from 40 years of loading pallets, gripping steering wheels, and building Vanguard logistics from a single rusted rig into a multi-state freight empire. Connor did not know about the empire. To my 32-year-old son, I was just a stubborn old man working a dead-end truck-driving gig who somehow managed to save enough pennies to help out with his wedding. He thought the money he spent so freely was the result of a modest retirement fund he was entitled to drain. He was wrong. I did not text him back. I sat down at my computer and opened the secure banking portal. I navigated to the joint checking account I had set up for him when he proposed to Vanessa. The balance sat at slightly over $200,000. I clicked on the transfer tab. I moved every single cent back into my corporate holding account. The balance instantly dropped to zero. Next, I went to the credit card management portal. Connor was an authorized user on my Platinum corporate account. I selected his name and clicked Revoke Access. The digital guillotine fell. Finally, I opened the pending wire transfers. A transaction for $40,000 was scheduled to hit the wedding venue account in 10 minutes. I hit cancel. The screen flashed a green confirmation checkmark. I closed the laptop. The silence in the room was absolute. Less than 3 minutes later, my phone rang. The caller ID showed the name of the luxury estate where the wedding was to be held. I answered. A panicked voice rushed through the speaker. "Mr. Reed, I am so sorry to bother you at this hour, but our system just notified us that your wire transfer for the remaining venue balance was canceled. We have vendors arriving at dawn, and we cannot unlock the grounds without the final $40,000. I kept my voice perfectly level. "You will have to speak to the groom about that." The manager stammered, "But Mr. Reed, the contract is pending your wire. What should I tell the catering team?" I leaned back in my chair. "Tell them the groom is responsible for the balance." I hung up the phone. I grabbed my keys and walked out to the driveway. I climbed into my 1998 Ford pickup. It squeaked as I turned the ignition, the engine rumbling to life. I drove across town to the high-end bridal district. The streets were lined with expensive boutiques and imported luxury cars. I pulled up right next to a gleaming white Porsche parked illegally in a loading zone. It was Vanessa's car. Or rather, it was my car. I funded the lease entirely through a subsidiary shell company of Vanguard Logistics. I put the truck in park and waited. A heavy-duty tow truck pulled in right behind the Porsche. The driver stepped out, holding a clipboard, looking confused at my beat-up Ford. I rolled down my window and handed him the authorization forms. He checked the vehicle identification number against his paperwork, nodded, and immediately hooked up the winch. The hydraulic gears whined loudly. The noise pierced through the glass doors of the bridal boutique. Vanessa stormed out onto the sidewalk mid-fitting. She was wearing a silk robe, her hair pinned halfway up. She started screaming at the tow truck driver, waving her arms frantically. "What are you doing? Drop my car right now. You are making a huge mistake." The driver ignored her, securing the chains. Vanessa spun around, looking for someone to complain to, and locked eyes with me sitting in the cab of my truck. Her face twisted into a mask of pure fury. She marched over to my window and slammed her manicured hand against the glass. "Open this window," she demanded. "Tell this idiot to unhook my car. There is obviously a bank error with the lease payment. Fix it. You are supposed to be paying for this." I lowered the window just 2 inches. I did not raise my voice. I did not show an ounce of anger. I simply slid a crisp white envelope through the gap. Vanessa snatched it. She ripped it open right there on the sidewalk. She stared at the paper. It was the official lease termination agreement citing immediate repossession due to non-payment. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. She glared at me, her eyes burning with hatred. "You're going to ruin my wedding weekend over some stupid banking glitch. Connor is going to tear you apart." She pulled out her phone and furiously began dialing his number. I rolled the window up, put the truck in gear, and drove away. Before I even reached the end of the block, my phone began to light up. Incoming call from Connor. Then another. Then a text. Then 5 more calls. I let the phone buzz on the passenger seat. The storm hit just after midnight. Rain lashed against the windows of my house. At exactly 2 in the morning, heavy, violent pounding shook my front door. I walked down the hallway and unlocked the deadbolt. Connor stood on the porch, drenched in rain, his chest heaving. His eyes were wild, darting between me and the dark interior of my house. He did not say hello. He shoved his way past me into the entryway. "What is wrong with you?" he shouted, his voice cracking with rage. My credit cards were declined at the rehearsal dinner. The venue manager cornered me in front of Vanessa. Entire family asking for $40,000. And Vanessa Carr got towed while she was trying on her dress. "Do you have any idea how humiliating this is?" I stood perfectly still. "You told me not to come to the wedding because my work clothes would embarrass you," I said, my voice dangerously quiet. "I am simply removing my embarrassing money from your life as well." Connor laughed, a harsh, bitter sound. "Are you insane? You are a truck driver. You got lucky with some decent investments, and now you want to act like you control my life. I will cut you out completely. You will never see me, you will never see Vanessa, and you will never see any grandchildren. You are going to be entirely alone." He had absolutely no idea. He did not know that the luxury condo he lived in was owned by a holding company I created. He did not know that the suit he was currently wearing was paid for by the dividends of my freight contracts. He believed he was a self-made man, entirely unaware that he was standing on a foundation I had poured with my own sweat. I reached into my back pocket and pulled out a folded document. I handed it to him. "What is this?" he snapped. "Read it," I replied. He unfolded the damp paper. His eyes scanned the text. It was a 30-day eviction notice for his downtown condo. The property owner listed at the top was Vanguard Logistics. Connor looked up, confused. "Vanguard Logistics? What does your old trucking company have to do with my landlord?" "I am Vanguard Logistics," I stated. "I own your building. I own your car. And as of tonight, I am evicting you." Connor violently swats the paper away, sending it fluttering to the wet floorboards. "You are bluffing," he spat, stepping aggressively toward me. "You are a bitter, lonely old man trying to ruin the best thing that ever happened to me. Well, it is not going to work. Tomorrow I am bringing Vanessa father here. Douglas has lawyers you cannot even fathom. He is going to sue you for breach of verbal contract. He will rip every last dime out of your pathetic little retirement fund. We do not need you." I looked at the son I had sacrificed everything for. The entitlement radiating from him was a sickness. I did not yell. I did not argue. I simply pointed to the door. "Get off my property." Connor sneered, turned on his heel, and marched out into the pouring rain. I slowly closed the door until the lock clicked into place. The real war had just been declared. The gravel of my driveway ground violently under the weight of 3 oversized black SUVs. They did not simply park. They executed a hostile blockade. The lead vehicle angled its heavy chrome grille directly toward my front porch steps, sealing off any exit route for my battered Ford pickup. The two trailing vehicles fanned out, blocking the perimeter. It was a tactical maneuver designed to intimidate a display of brute financial force meant to remind me of my place in their world. I did not rise from my wooden rocking chair. I remained seated in the crisp morning air, taking a slow, measured sip of my black coffee. The dark roast burned pleasantly down my throat, grounding me in the absolute stillness of the moment. Today was supposed to be the day I watched my only son exchange vows. Instead, it was the day the bill came due. The doors of the lead SUV flew open. Connor practically fell out of the passenger side. He looked entirely unraveled. The sharp lines of his custom tuxedo mocked his pale, sleep-deprived face and bloodshot eyes. He stumbled over the uneven dirt, his manicured shoes sinking into the mud. Vanessa erupted from the rear door of the second vehicle. She was not wearing her pristine wedding gown. She was stuffed into an expensive velvet tracksuit, her face flushed and blotchy, her perfectly styled hair wild around her shoulders. She gripped her phone so tightly her knuckles were white. From the third vehicle emerged Douglas Blake. I had endured Douglas' company exactly once during a suffocatingly arrogant dinner where he spent 2 hours complaining about yacht club dues while purposefully ignoring my denim jacket and calloused hands. Today he wore a tailored charcoal suit that likely cost more than my first freight rig. He buttoned his jacket with a sharp, aggressive flick of his wrist and led the charge up my walkway like a general marching into a conquered village. Connor stopped at the bottom of the porch stairs. He pointed a trembling finger at my face. "You ruined everything," he shouted, his voice cracking under the crushing weight of his own panic. "The venue management is threatening to chain the main gates shut. The caterers are holding our entire menu hostage in their trucks. Vanessa is having a nervous breakdown, and you are just sitting here drinking coffee on your porch. You left us stranded at the altar." I did not reply to my son. I kept my eyes locked on Douglas, who was marching up the wooden steps. He did not ask for permission to cross my threshold. He invaded my space, stopping less than 12 inches from my chair. He tried to use his height and the suffocating scent of his expensive cologne to assert total dominance over the situation. "Listen to me very carefully, old man," Douglas said, his voice dropping into a low, menacing register designed to instill panic. "I do not know what kind of petty blue-collar temper tantrum you think you are throwing right now, but you are absolutely not going to embarrass my family on my daughter's wedding day." I placed my coffee mug on the wooden side table. The ceramic clinked loudly against the timber. I stood up slowly. I am exactly 2 inches shorter than Douglas, but I have spent 40 years hauling freight wrestling iron chains and building a logistics empire from the ground up. Douglas has spent his entire life lifting golf clubs and signing papers his father handed him. He instinctively took a half step back when I straightened my spine, but his bloated ego rapidly forced him forward again. "Your daughter embarrassed herself," I said, keeping my voice dangerously quiet. "She demanded I be banned from my own son's wedding because my work boots and denim jackets offend her high society sensibilities. Then she fully expected me to foot a $40,000 venue bill for the privilege of being erased from the family photos. I simply obliged her cruel request. I removed my presents and I removed my money." Vanessa shrieked from the driveway, stomping her foot into the gravel. "It was an $82,000 bill. You only paid half." My car was repossessed right in front of my bridal seamstress. I had to call a cab in tears. "You are a spiteful monster." Douglas raised his hand to silence his daughter, never breaking eye contact with me. He sneered, a crooked, ugly smile spreading across his face. "You think you are clever," he said, his tone dripping with utter contempt. "You think you can play financial games with people like us. Let me explain exactly how the real world works, Malcolm. I have an elite legal team on a massive retainer. They eat uneducated laborers like you for breakfast. By Monday morning, my lawyers will have an emergency injunction filed against you for breach of contract and severe emotional distress. I will legally freeze whatever meager, pathetic retirement fund you scraped together driving trucks. I will take this miserable shack you live in. I will take your pension. I will leave you working a cash register at a gas station just to pay off the legal fees for ruining my daughter's perfect day." Connor chimed in from the damp grass, completely emboldened by his future father-in-law's ruthless threats. You brought this entirely on yourself, Dad. We are taking everything you have left. Douglas took a final aggressive step forward, deliberately crossing the invisible boundary of personal space. He jabbed his manicured index finger hard into the center of my chest. You are going to wire that remaining $40,000 to the venue right this second, Douglas demanded, pressing his finger painfully into my sternum. Then you are going to call your bank and get my daughter's car returned to her driveway. If you do exactly as I command right now, I might convince my legal team to let you keep this pathetic piece of land. I looked down at the finger pressing into my chest. Then I looked up into Douglas' eyes. I saw exactly what he was. A hollow, desperate man, terrified of losing control, relying entirely on bluster and empty threats to bully a man he believed was vastly beneath him. He believed I was a simple, struggling laborer. He believed his tailored suit gave him supreme authority over my property and my life. He had absolutely no idea that the ground he was standing on was paid for in cash, or that the legal team he was aggressively threatening me with was absolute child's play compared to the corporate sharks I kept on speed dial. Remove your hand from my chest, I said. Douglas laughed, a short, barking sound of disbelief. Or what? You are going to hit me, please do. Assaulting me will just make my lawsuit against you that much easier to win. I did not hit him. I did not raise my voice or show a single ounce of anger. I simply stepped past him effortlessly, brushing past his attempt to physically block my path. I walked to the very edge of the porch, looking out over the 3 expensive SUVs idling aggressively in my driveway. I placed 2 fingers to my mouth and let out a sharp, piercing whistle that cut through the morning air like a siren. The reaction was immediate and flawless. From the deep shadows of the detached garage, 2 massive men stepped out into the morning light. They were not local police officers. They were not neighborhood watch volunteers. They were highly trained private security contractors from Vanguard Logistics' elite protection detail. They wore unmarked black tactical gear, moving with absolute silent precision. At the exact same moment, the side door of my house swung open, and 2 more security personnel stepped out onto the porch, instantly flanking Douglas from behind. They did not draw weapons, but their physical presence was an overwhelming, suffocating force. They stood with their hands clasped firmly in front of them, their eyes locked onto Douglas and his drivers with cold, professional menace. Douglas spun around, his arrogant smirk vanishing in a fraction of a second. The color completely drained from his face as he realized he was suddenly surrounded, outnumbered, and drastically outmatched on a property he thought was entirely defenseless. His personal drivers, who had been leaning casually against the SUVs, quickly stood up straight and immediately retreated behind the open doors of their vehicles, wanting absolutely no part of this sudden escalation. "What is this?" Douglas stammered, his voice pitching higher as his false bravado evaporated. "Who are these people? You are a truck driver. You cannot afford a private security detail. This is illegal intimidation. I am calling the police right now." "Feel free to dial them," I replied, folding my arms calmly across my chest. "But before you make that call, you should probably know that aggressively trespassing on private property and physically assaulting the homeowner by shoving your finger into his chest gives my security detail the absolute legal right to detain you by force until the authorities arrive. I highly doubt you want to spend your only daughter's wedding day locked in a county holding cell." Vanessa ran up to Connor, clutching his tuxedo sleeve frantically. "Connor, do something right now. Tell your crazy father to call them off." Connor was completely paralyzed, his eyes darting frantically between the imposing security guards and me. He had spent his entire adult life severely underestimating me, viewing me as a stepping stone, and now his brain could not process the terrifying reality standing in his own father's front yard. "Dad, please," Connor begged, his voice trembling with genuine fear. "Just send the venue the money. We can talk about everything else later. Just fix this so the wedding can happen today." I kept my gaze fixed entirely on the end of the long dirt road leading to my property. I was not intimidated by Douglas' empty, pathetic threats, and I was entirely immune to Connor's desperate, selfish pleas. I was simply stalling, I knew exactly what was about to happen. I had timed this orchestration perfectly. The sound of a heavy engine turning off the main highway echoed sharply through the dense pine trees. A sleek black luxury sedan turned onto my driveway, its tires kicking up a massive cloud of dust as it smoothly navigated the long dirt path. The car pulled to a deliberate stop directly behind Douglas' barricade of SUVs, sealing the exit and trapping them entirely on my land. The driver's door opened, and a tall man stepped out into the sunlight. He was dressed in an immaculate dark navy suit, carrying a thick, heavy leather briefcase. He adjusted his silver glasses and looked at the chaotic, panicked scene unfolding on my lawn with absolute clinical detachment. It was Winston Pierce, my lead corporate attorney, and he was not here to negotiate. Winston Pierce ascended the wooden steps with the measured, unhurried pace of an executioner. He did not acknowledge the security guards flanking the porch. He did not spare a single glance for Connor, who was trembling on the lawn, or Vanessa, who was clutching her velvet tracksuit in escalating panic. Winston locked his cold, gray eyes entirely on Douglas Blake. Douglas puffed out his chest, attempting to project authority. He looked Winston up and down, taking in the dark navy suit and the silver glasses. Douglas let out a sharp, derisive scoff. "Is this your representation, Malcolm?" Douglas mocked, his voice echoing loudly across the damp yard. "Some local small-town attorney you pulled out of a strip mall office. My legal team operates out of Manhattan. They bill $4,000 an hour. This man is going to be laughed out of the courtroom before he even files his paperwork." Winston did not react to the insult. He stopped exactly 2 feet from Douglas. He unlatched the heavy brass clasp of the leather-bound folio he carried. The sharp click sounded like a gunshot in the tense morning air. He extracted a thick stack of legal documents printed on heavy watermarked parchment and extended them toward Douglas. "I am not here to represent Mr. Reed in a civil dispute regarding a wedding," Winston said, his voice smooth, resonant, and entirely devoid of emotion. "I am here in my capacity as the chief legal counsel for Vanguard Logistics. I strongly suggest you read the first page, Mr. Blake. Your Manhattan lawyers are going to be entirely useless to you after this morning." Douglas snatched the documents from Winston's hand. He let out another arrogant chuckle, determined to maintain his facade of untouchable superiority. He flipped open the cover page, his eyes scanning the dense legal text. Malcolm remained standing on the porch, his face a mask of absolute stone. He watched the exact second the reality of the situation breached Douglas' towering ego. It happened in agonizing slow motion. The arrogant sneer wiped away from Douglas' mouth. His jaw went slack. All the color drained from his face, leaving his skin the color of dirty ash. A thick bead of sweat broke out along his hairline. His hands, previously balled into aggressive fists, began to shake so violently that the thick parchment pages rattled against each other. "This is impossible," Douglas whispered, his voice stripped of all its commanding volume. "This is a forged document. My holding company is completely secure. You cannot possibly own this debt." "We do not forge documents, Mr. Blake," Winston replied, adjusting his silver glasses. "For the past 14 months, Blake Commercial Properties has been bleeding capital. You over-leveraged your entire portfolio to acquire 3 high-rise developments downtown. When the commercial market dipped, you panicked. You sought out high-interest mezzanine loans from secondary private equity firms just to keep your head above water. You desperately tried to keep this hidden from your board of directors." Vanessa stepped forward, her brow furrowed in confusion. "Dad, what is he talking about? What loans?" Douglas ignored her, his eyes darting frantically across the paper, desperately searching for a loophole that did not exist. 3 weeks ago, Winston continued, his tone clinical and unrelenting. Vanguard Capital, a subsidiary of Vanguard Logistics, quietly purchased every single one of those secondary loans. We bought your debt, Mr. Blake. All of it. You now owe Vanguard Capital $38 million. And according to the financial audits we finalized at midnight, you are in direct violation of 3 distinct liquidity covenants. You are broke. No. Douglas stammered, stepping backward, his expensive leather shoes scraping against the porch planks. You cannot call the note. We have a grace period. My brokers are liquidating assets next quarter. I have buyers lined up. You have absolutely nothing, Winston stated flatly. Notice of default was filed with the state at 6 o'clock this morning. We are officially calling the note. You have exactly 72 hours to produce $38 million in liquid capital. If you fail to do so, Vanguard Logistics will seize your entire commercial real estate portfolio, including your corporate headquarters, and we will initiate hostile bankruptcy proceedings against you personally. Douglas physically stumbled. He had to reach out and grab the wooden porch railing just to keep his balance. The wealthy, untouchable aristocrat, who had marched up the driveway threatening to destroy Malcolm, was completely gone. In his place stood a ruined, terrified man staring into the abyss of absolute financial annihilation. Vanessa stared at her father. Her mouth hung open. The reality of the situation crashed into her with devastating force. She was not the heiress to a real estate empire. Her family was destitute. The lavish lifestyle, the designer clothes, the country club memberships, they were all built on a towering mountain of toxic debt that Malcolm now completely controlled. She spun around. Her eyes locked onto Connor, who was still standing paralyzed on the lawn. Vanessa did not offer her father a single word of comfort. She did not ask how she could help him. She instantly weaponized her panic and aimed it directly at the man she was supposed to marry in a matter of hours. "Connor, do something!" Vanessa screamed, her voice shrill and echoing off the pine trees. "You have to fix this right now. Call your wealth manager. Call the bank. You need to wire the $38 million to my father holding company." Connor flinched as if he had been physically struck. He looked at Vanessa with wide, terrified eyes. "Vanessa, I cannot just wire $38 million. I do not have access to that kind of liquidity. Use the trust fund." Vanessa demanded, stepping off the porch and marching toward him, her hands curled into claws. "You told me you had a massive family trust. You told my father you were the sole heir to a generational fortune. The wedding is in 4 hours. My father is about to lose everything. Access the trust right now and pay off this ridiculous debt." Connor began to hyperventilate. He backed away from his furious fiancée, his expensive tuxedo shoes slipping on the wet grass. He had spent the last 2 years weaving an intricate, glittering web of lies. He had portrayed himself to the Blake family as a wealthy prodigy, a man who possessed limitless resources, a man who belonged in their elite social circles. He had purposefully hidden his father, treating Malcolm like a shameful secret, all to maintain the illusion that he was a self-made millionaire. Now cornered and completely exposed, Connor looked past Vanessa. He looked up at the porch. He looked directly at Malcolm. "Dad." Connor pleaded, his voice breaking into a pathetic, desperate whine. "Dad, please. You have to help me. You cannot let them do this. You have the money. You own the company. Please just authorize the release of my trust fund. Save her father company. Save the wedding. I will do whatever you want. Just give me access to my trust." Malcolm stood on the porch, looking down at the stranger he had raised. Connor was 32 years old, yet he was begging like a spoiled child, entirely willing to drain his family legacy just to buy the approval of a woman who was currently screaming at him and a man who had just threatened to leave Malcolm penniless. Connor had treated Malcolm with absolute contempt for years. He had barred his father from his wedding to avoid explaining his existence. He had broken into the home office, attempted to forge a signature, and demanded his lavish life be funded from the shadows. Malcolm did not raise his voice. He did not show an ounce of pity. The silence stretched across the yard, heavy and suffocating, until Malcolm finally spoke. "There is no trust fund for a son who treats his father like a parasite," Malcolm stated coldly, the words dropping like heavy stones into the morning air. Connor froze. His mouth opened, but he could not breathe. "There never was a trust fund." Malcolm continued, ensuring his voice carried clearly to Vanessa and Douglas. "Every dime you have spent over the last 2 years came directly from my checking account. The luxury condo you live in is owned by my company. The car you drive is leased under my corporate name. The tailored suit you are wearing right now was paid for by the sweat of the drivers you pretend do not exist. You are not a millionaire, Connor. You are a dependent. The suffocating silence that followed my revelation did not last long. It was shattered by a sharp, frantic ringing from Vanessa's velvet pocket. The sudden noise made her jump. She yanked the phone out, her eyes darting to the screen. The caller ID glowed brightly in the overcast morning light. It was the estate manager from the wedding venue. Vanessa answered the call with trembling fingers pressing the phone tight against her ear. Her voice was thin and desperate as she spoke. "Hello, this is Vanessa. Is everything ready?" The voice on the other end was loud enough to bleed through the receiver. It was not a voice of congratulations. It was a voice of absolute panic. The manager informed her that the massive wrought iron gates of the luxury estate were padlocked shut. 300 guests were currently backed up on the two-lane highway, creating a mile-long traffic jam of imported cars and hired limousines. The caterers had refused to unload a single tray of food. In fact, they were actively loading the champagne and imported seafood back into their refrigerated trucks. The venue required the final $40,000 wire transfer immediately, or the entire event would be permanently canceled within 5 minutes. Vanessa dropped the phone from her ear. She did not hang up. She simply let her arm fall to her side, her chest heaving as she struggled to draw oxygen into her lungs. The pristine image of her high society wedding was burning to the ground in real time. She spun around and charged at Connor. She grabbed the lapels of his custom tuxedo, her perfectly manicured nails digging into the expensive fabric. "Fix this right now!" Vanessa screamed, her voice tearing through the quiet neighborhood. "Call your bank. Call your broker. I do not care what you have to liquidate. Wire that money before my entire family becomes the laughingstock of the city." Connor stood perfectly rigid. He did not reach for his phone. He did not attempt to soothe her. He simply stared at her with the empty, hollow gaze of a man who had just watched his entire life disintegrate. "I cannot." Connor whispered, his voice completely devoid of strength. "Do not tell me you cannot." Vanessa shrieked, shaking him violently by the collar. "You told my father you had millions in a blind trust. You told me you made 7 figures trading logistics contracts. Stop acting like a coward and pay for our wedding." Connor finally reached into his pocket. He pulled out his smartphone. His hands were shaking so badly, he dropped it on the wet grass. He scrambled to pick it up, his knees staining with mud. He unlocked the screen and opened his personal banking application. He did not say a word. He simply shoved the glowing screen directly into Vanessa's face. Vanessa blinked, reading the digital numbers. Her mouth fell open. The available balance on the screen was exactly $42.15. "There is no trust fund." Connor choked out tears of absolute humiliation, finally spilling on his cheeks. "My father owns the company. He owns my condo. He pays my credit card bills. I do not have $40,000, Vanessa. I do not even have enough money to buy us a tank of gas to drive away from here." The illusion shattered with a deafening finality. The wealthy, sophisticated heir Vanessa thought she was marrying vanished instantly, leaving behind a broke, dependent man who had lied to her every single day of their relationship. The sharp crack of flesh against flesh echoed across the lawn. Vanessa struck Connor across the face with all the strength she possessed. The slap was so violent it snapped his head to the side. A bright red welt bloomed instantly across his pale cheek. Connor stumbled backward, clutching his face, but he did not defend himself. He knew he deserved it. "You worthless, pathetic liar!" Vanessa hissed, her voice dropping into a venomous growl. "I wasted 2 years of my life with a truck driver's dependent. You let me ban the only man with actual money from our wedding." Douglas Blake moved suddenly. The wealthy real estate tycoon who had marched onto my property threatening to destroy me, just 10 minutes prior, stepped forward and grabbed his daughter's arm. He pulled Vanessa away from Connor. Douglas was not acting out of paternal protection. He was acting out of pure, terrifying financial calculation. His mind had finally processed the catastrophic reality of the situation. Douglas owed my parent company $38 million. The foreclosure notice had already been filed. His daughter's wedding was a spectacular public failure. His entire world was collapsing, and he suddenly realized that the only person on this entire property holding a lifeline was the man standing on the porch in a faded denim jacket. Douglas released his daughter's arm. He smoothed the front of his charcoal suit, taking a deep, unsteady breath to compose himself. He turned his back on Connor and walked slowly toward the porch stairs. The arrogant strut was completely gone. His shoulders were slumped. His eyes were wide and desperate. He stopped at the bottom of the steps, looking up at me with a sickening display of forced humility. "Malcolm, please," Douglas said, his voice practically trembling with desperation. "Let us take a step back and breathe. Emotions are running incredibly high today. My daughter is stressed. Connor made some very foolish mistakes trying to impress us. But we are about to be family. We are supposed to be uniting our bloodlines today. We cannot let pride destroy something so beautiful." I looked down at him. I did not move a single muscle. Douglas swallowed hard, sweating profusely under his tailored collar. He forced a painfully artificial smile onto his face. "I apologize for my earlier tone, Malcolm. I was completely out of line. I was just acting as a protective father. But you have proven your point. You have proven you are a formidable businessman. I respect that. I truly do. Let us put this unfortunate misunderstanding behind us. Come to the wedding. I will personally arrange a VIP seat for you in the front row. You can walk down the aisle with us. Just authorize the venue payment and tell your lawyer to halt the foreclosure on my firm. We can be partners, Malcolm. We can rule this city together." The sheer audacity of his pivot was nauseating. Less than 20 minutes ago, he had threatened to leave me working a cash register at a gas station. Now he was offering me a front row seat to a wedding I was explicitly banned from, hoping I would simply hand over millions of dollars to save his fragile ego. He did not respect me. He only respected the fact that my hand was currently wrapped around his throat. I looked past Douglas. I looked at Vanessa, who was staring at me with hungry, desperate eyes, praying I would rescue her social standing. I looked at Connor, who was still clutching his bruised cheek, unable to even meet my gaze. They had all viewed me as a disposable resource, a silent ATM they could use and discard whenever it suited their vanity. I reached into the front pocket of my denim jacket. I did not pull out a checkbook. I did not pull out my phone to authorize a wire transfer. I pulled out a small black plastic remote control. I do not negotiate with parasites. I stated, my voice carrying the heavy, immovable weight of absolute finality. And I do not attend weddings where I am an embarrassment. I pressed the single red button on the remote control. A loud, heavy mechanical grind erupted from the end of the long dirt driveway. Douglas whipped his head around in panic. Vanessa gasped. Connor finally looked up. At the base of the property line, the massive reinforced steel security gates began to slide along their iron tracks. The heavy metal screeched, echoing through the quiet neighborhood. The 3 black SUVs parked aggressively in my driveway were now entirely useless. The drivers scrambled out of their vehicles, watching in horror as the heavy steel bars met in the center of the road with a loud, resounding metallic crash. The magnetic locks engaged, instantly sealing the property entirely. "What are you doing?" Douglas shouted, his voice cracking as his panic returned in full force. "Open those gates right now. We have to leave. My daughter's guests are waiting on the highway." "You are not going anywhere, Douglas," I replied calmly, tucking the remote back into my pocket. Winston stepped forward, holding up a cell phone. "When you aggressively breached the property line and physically assaulted my client, Mr. Blake, I contacted the local authorities." Winston stated, his tone perfectly flat and professional. "The police were dispatched 12 minutes ago. They should be arriving at the gate momentarily." As if summoned by Winston's words, the distant wail of police sirens pierced the morning air. The sound grew louder, rapidly approaching the neighborhood. The color completely drained from Vanessa's face. She looked at the locked gates. She looked at her ruined fiancé. She looked at the man who held the deed to her father's financial ruin. "You trapped us," Vanessa whispered, stepping backward in absolute terror. "You trespassed on private property to demand money you did not earn." I corrected her, maintaining my unyielding stance on the porch. "You made your choices. Now you get to stay exactly where you are and face the consequences." The flashing red and blue lights of the approaching police cruisers began to reflect off the tall pine trees lining the street. The sirens grew deafening, signaling the absolute and unavoidable end of their arrogant reign. The sharp wail of approaching sirens shattered the tense morning air. Through the thick iron bars of the front gate, flashing red and blue lights painted the surrounding woods in frantic bursts of color. 2 local police cruisers pulled up to the barricade, sitting idle as their sirens abruptly cut off. I gave a slight nod to my security guard. He punched a code into the keypad. The massive gates slowly groaned open just wide enough to let the cruisers slip through before sliding shut again with a heavy, definitive clang. Douglas Blake visibly relaxed. The color rushed back into his face. His posture shifted instantly, transforming him back into the arrogant, untouchable aristocrat he pretended to be. He straightened his charcoal suit jacket and marched directly toward the lead police cruiser before it had even fully parked. He was entirely convinced that these officers were his personal rescue squad, expecting his tailored suit and demanding tone to instantly command their blind obedience. "Officer, get out here right now," Douglas shouted, pointing a manicured finger at my porch. "This insane old man has illegally trapped my family on his property. He is using armed thugs to hold us hostage and attempting to extort me for millions of dollars. I want him arrested immediately. I am Douglas Blake, and my lawyers will have your badge if you do not act this exact second." The door of the lead cruiser opened. Out stepped Chief Miller, a man I had known for 15 years. He was a broad-shouldered veteran of the force with a deeply lined face. He closed his car door calmly, ignoring the frantic shouting of the supposed billionaire standing in my driveway. Chief Miller walked right past Douglas without offering him a single glance. He stopped at the base of my porch and looked up at me. "Good morning, Malcolm," Chief Miller said, his voice carrying a tone of deep, respectful familiarity. "Sorry to interrupt your morning coffee. We got a call about a trespassing disturbance." Douglas spun around, his jaw dropping in absolute disbelief. "What are you doing?" Douglas shrieked, his voice pitching into an undignified squeak. "Why are you greeting him like an old friend? He is a nobody. Arrest him before he tries to extort any more money from my family." Chief Miller slowly turned to face Douglas. His expression was completely devoid of patience. "Sir, I highly suggest you lower your voice. You are currently trespassing on private property owned by a man who prefers to be left alone." Douglas sneered, waving his hands frantically. "He is a truck driver. You are taking orders from a truck driver. I am telling you to arrest him for extortion right this instant." Chief Miller took a slow, measured step toward Douglas. The aristocratic facade meant absolutely nothing to the chief. Douglas had no idea that the modest town he was currently standing in owed its new emergency response vehicles, its renovated youth center, and a significant portion of the police pension fund directly to anonymous donations from Vanguard Logistics. Malcolm Reed was not a nobody. He was the silent architect of the town municipal safety net. Douglas did not know he was demanding the arrest of the very man who quietly kept this entire community afloat. "The only person getting arrested today is you if you do not step back," Chief Miller stated, his voice cold and hard as steel. "I have multiple witnesses right here who can confirm you aggressively breached a private gate, physically assaulted the homeowner, and are now creating a public disturbance. Put your hands behind your back." Douglas froze. His eyes darted wildly, searching for a way out of a nightmare that was rapidly compounding. "You cannot do this," he stammered, taking a clumsy step backward. "Do you have any idea who I am?" "You are a trespasser," Chief Miller replied, grabbing Douglas by the shoulder and spinning him around. The metallic click of handcuffs echoed across the lawn. Douglas Blake, the man who had just threatened to leave me penniless and working a gas station register, was roughly bent over the hood of the police cruiser. He gasped in utter humiliation as the cuffs were locked tightly around his wrists. Vanessa screamed, covering her mouth, watching her untouchable father being treated like a common street criminal. Connor watched Douglas being shoved into the back of the police cruiser. The last shred of his fabricated elite life evaporated into the damp air. He fell to his knees in the muddy grass, completely ruining his custom tuxedo trousers. He looked up at me with a face entirely drenched in tears. The arrogant, entitled groom was gone. Only a terrified, broken child remained stripped of all his stolen wealth and borrowed confidence. "Dad, please." Connor sobbed, his voice echoing pathetically across the yard. "Please stop this. You have made your point. You took the money. You took the condo. You ruined Vanessa family. My entire life is completely over. Just tell the police to let us go. I will leave. I will never ask you for anything ever again. Just let me walk away from this." I looked down at the boy I had raised. I had spent decades driving through the night, hauling heavy freight across frozen, treacherous highways, sleeping in roadside truck stops, just so he would never know the bitter taste of poverty. I had silently funded his extravagant lifestyle, hoping he would eventually mature into a responsible, honorable man. Instead, he had chosen to treat my hard work as a shameful secret to be hidden from his new high society friends. He had chosen to ban me from his wedding day simply because my presence did not fit his fabricated aesthetic. But his utter lack of respect was not the reason I was ending his life as he knew it. The wedding insult was merely the catalyst. The true betrayal ran much deeper, and it demanded absolute justice. I did not answer his desperate pleas. I reached into the inside pocket of my denim jacket. My calloused fingers brushed against a small, cold metal object. I pulled it out, holding it up in the morning light. It was a silver portable memory drive. I stepped down off the porch, walking slowly toward Chief Miller. Connor watched my hand, his sobbing abruptly stopping as a new wave of absolute terror washed over his face. "Chief," I said, keeping my voice perfectly steady, "before you clear the property, there is one more piece of business we need to conclude." Chief Miller turned away from the cruiser and looked at the small metal drive in my hand. "What do you have there, Malcolm?" I looked directly at Connor. His eyes were wide with pure, panicked recognition. He knew exactly what was on that drive. 3 weeks ago, I stated, my voice carrying clearly across the silent yard. Someone breached the security system of my home office while I was out of the state negotiating a logistics contract. The intruder bypassed the secondary alarms and accessed my private filing cabinets. Connor scrambled backward in the mud, shaking his head violently. "No! Dad, do not do this! Please do not do this!" The intruder specifically targeted the corporate lending folios for Vanguard Logistics. I continued ignoring his pathetic whimpering. The individual stole several highly sensitive financial documents and attempted to forge my signature on a massive corporate loan application. They were attempting to secure $750,000 using my parent company as the primary collateral. Vanessa gasped, staring at Connor in renewed horror. She took a step away from him as if he were carrying a contagious disease. "You tried to steal almost $1 million from him," she whispered, her voice trembling with pure disgust. "You really are nothing but a common desperate thief." It was not just theft. I corrected her, refusing to break eye contact with my son. It was a calculated attempt to leverage my entire life of hard work to fund a wedding and a lifestyle built entirely on shallow lies. Fortunately, my office is equipped with hidden high-definition security cameras that link directly to a secure offshore server. The intruder was entirely unaware that every single second of his desperate forgery attempt was being recorded in crystal-clear detail. I handed the silver drive to Chief Miller. This drive contains the unedited security footage from that night. It also contains the forged loan documents, the digital timestamps of the security breach, and a complete audit of the funds he has already fraudulently siphoned from my corporate accounts. I am formally pressing charges for breaking and entering grand larceny and felony forgery against my son. Chief Miller took the drive, slipping it into his uniform pocket. His expression hardened as he turned his gaze toward Connor, who was now trembling uncontrollably on the ground. Dad, you cannot send me to prison. Connor screamed, his voice tearing through the quiet morning. I am your son. You are supposed to protect me. My mother would never forgive you for doing this to me. The sudden, arrogant mention of his mother sent a cold, sharp shock of anger straight through my chest. Evelyn had been the kindest, hardest-working woman I had ever known. She had scrubbed floors and balanced our meager checkbook at the kitchen table until 2 a.m. Evelyn had died of cancer when Connor was 12. Her final dying wish had been for me to raise a man of unwavering honor. Connor had taken her beautiful memory and spat on it with his boundless toxic greed. He had absolutely no right to speak her name. Your mother wanted you to learn the value of an honest day of work. I said, my voice dropping to a low, dangerous volume that commanded absolute silence. You chose to be a parasite. You chose to treat the people who loved you as disposable resources. You are going to prison because of your own arrogant criminal choices. You do not get to hide behind her memory to escape your consequences. Chief Miller gestured silently to his partner. The second officer approached Connor, pulling him up roughly from the thick mud by his expensive tuxedo jacket. Connor fought weakly, kicking his legs and sobbing, but the officer easily overpowered him. The harsh metallic snap of handcuffs locking around his wrists echoed through the yard, sealing his absolute downfall. Connor was shoved forcefully toward the second police cruiser. He dragged his feet, crying hysterically, calling out for Vanessa to help him. Vanessa did not move a single inch. She stood paralyzed on the damp grass, watching the man she thought was a millionaire heir being thrown into the back of a police car, covered in mud and facing years in a federal penitentiary. The entire world they had meticulously built together had been vaporized in a single morning. Chief Miller tipped his hat to me. We will process these items immediately, Malcolm. The detectives will likely be in touch later this afternoon to finalize your official statement. I appreciate it, Chief, I replied, offering a curt, respectful nod. The officers climbed into their cruisers. The heavy engines roared back to life. I pulled the small black remote from my pocket and pressed the button. The heavy steel gates at the end of the driveway began to slowly slide open, granting the police vehicles an exit from the property. As the cruisers rolled past the gates carrying my ruined son and his bankrupt father-in-law, I did not feel a single ounce of regret. I turned around, walked back up the wooden steps, and picked up my mug of black coffee. The natural order had been painfully but necessarily restored. The air inside the interrogation room was thick with the smell of floor wax and stale sweat. The walls were painted a dull, lifeless gray, illuminated by a single flickering fluorescent bulb that buzzed like a trapped hornet. I sat behind a scarred steel table, my hands folded calmly resting on the cold metal surface. Winston sat silently to my right, a closed manila folder positioned perfectly square in front of him. We did not speak. We simply waited for the reality of the morning to finish crushing the boy I used to call my son. The heavy steel door unlocked with a loud mechanical clank. A uniformed detective pushed the door open and led Connor into the small windowless room. The sight of him was genuinely pitiful. The sharp, elegant lines of his custom tuxedo were completely destroyed. His expensive silk bow tie had been confiscated. His crisp white shirt was unbuttoned at the collar and smeared with dried mud from his desperate collapse on my front lawn. He was shaking so violently that his handcuffs rattled a chaotic metallic rhythm against his wrists. The detective guided Connor to the bolted metal chair opposite the table and forced him to sit down. Connor slumped forward, his posture entirely defeated. He kept his eyes glued to the scuffed linoleum floor, terrified to look at me. The detective stepped back, leaning against the doorframe, giving us the room. Look at me, Connor, I said, my voice low and steady, carrying the immovable weight of a judge reading a final sentence. Connor flinched, but slowly lifted his head. His eyes were bloodshot, swimming in tears of absolute panic and humiliation. His jaw trembled uncontrollably. "Dad, please," he whispered, his voice cracking into a pathetic whine. "You have to tell them to let me go. I will lose everything. If this hits the public record, my career is over. No one in the financial sector will ever hire me. You are ruining my entire life over one stupid mistake." Winston let out a sharp, dry sigh. He opened the manila folder and slid a high-resolution color photograph across the steel table. It stopped directly in front of Connor. "That was not a mistake." I corrected him, leaning slightly forward so my words would strike him with full force. "Spilling a glass of water is a mistake. Forgetting to pay a utility bill is a mistake. Waiting until 2 in the morning, purposefully disabling the security cameras in my hallway, picking the lock to my private study, and spending 45 minutes digging through my corporate filing cabinets is a highly calculated criminal operation." Connor stared down at the photograph. It was a still frame captured from the hidden security camera I had installed in the ceiling vent. The image clearly showed Connor illuminated by the glow of a small flashlight, holding a stack of Vanguard Logistics corporate loan applications, his face twisted in desperate concentration. "You did not even have the basic intelligence to cover your tracks." I continued, my tone devoid of any parental warmth. "You thought, because I wear denim and steel-toed boots, that my company operates out of a shoebox. Vanguard Logistics utilizes military-grade encryption and off-site cloud backups. The moment you opened that filing cabinet, an alert was sent directly to my private phone. I watched you attempt to forge my signature on a $750,000 loan live from my hotel room in Chicago. I watched you practice my signature on a legal pad 14 times before you tried to sign the actual document. I was desperate." Connor sobbed, wrapping his handcuffed wrists around his torso as if trying to hold himself together. "You do not understand the pressure I was under, Dad. You do not understand the world Vanessa comes from. You cannot just show up to their dinners and their charity galas with nothing. You have to project success. You have to prove you belong." Winston slid a second document across the table. It was a comprehensive printed spreadsheet detailing 36 months of Connor financial history. "We understand your fabricated world perfectly well, Connor," Winston stated, his voice clinical and razor-sharp. "You were living in a luxury high-rise you could not afford, driving a European sports car you could not maintain, and taking Vanessa on private vacations to the Caribbean. When your modest salary could not cover the illusion, you turned to secondary unsecured lenders. You took out predatory loans with interest rates bordering on criminal extortion. You currently owe $412,000 in consumer and high-yield debt. You were drowning, and instead of asking your father for guidance, you decided to rob him blind to keep paying for a lifestyle that was entirely fake." Connor closed his eyes, weeping openly now. The tears dripped off his chin and splashed onto the cold steel table. "I did it for her," he cried. "I just wanted her family to respect me. I just wanted to be a man of status." "You wanted to be a man of status, but you were entirely ashamed of the man who actually built the wealth," I said. The anger I had been suppressing finally began to bleed into my voice. "You looked down on the people who haul freight and pack warehouses. You looked down on the dirt and the grease that put food on your table and paid for your college tuition. You were so terrified that Vanessa's wealthy father would see you standing next to a truck driver that you actively hid my existence." I reached into the inner pocket of my jacket. I bypassed my phone and my wallet. I pulled out a small rectangular piece of heavy stock paper. It was not a legal threat. It was not a police report. I placed it gently on the table and slid it across the metal surface until it rested directly over the photograph of his crime. Connor opened his tear-filled eyes and looked down at the paper. His breath hitched. His chest stopped moving completely. It was a certified cashier check drawn directly from my personal savings account. The payee line was left blank. The amount printed clearly in bold black ink was exactly $412,000. Connor stared at the check. His mouth opened, but his vocal cords refused to produce a single sound. His eyes darted frantically from the 7-digit number to my face and back to the check. "I knew exactly how much debt you were in, Connor." I explained, watching the devastating realization slowly crush his spirit. I audited your accounts months ago. I knew you were trapped in a cycle you could not escape. And despite your arrogance, despite your refusal to introduce me to your new elite friends, I was still your father. I sat at my desk last night and I wrote that check. I was going to bring it to you this morning. I was going to hand it to you before you put on that tuxedo. I was going to clear your slate, wipe out your massive debt, and give you the ultimate wedding gift. A fresh start. A chance to be a real man without the suffocating weight of your financial lies. Connor let out a choked, agonizing gasp. He reached a trembling, handcuffed hand toward the check, but he did not dare touch it. But I never handed it to you, I said, pulling the check back across the table and slipping it effortlessly back into my jacket pocket. Because while I was sitting at my desk holding your salvation in my hand, my phone vibrated. I received a text message from my only son. A message informing me that my presence was no longer required at his wedding. A message explicitly stating that my work clothes were too much of an embarrassment to explain to the very people whose approval you were destroying your life to earn. Connor began to hyperventilate. The air rushed in and out of his lungs in rapid, shallow gasps. The absolute horror of his situation crashed down upon him. He had been hours away from complete financial rescue. He had been hours away from walking out from under a mountain of crushing debt. And he had single-handedly thrown it all into an incinerator, because he was too arrogant and too embarrassed to let his father stand in the same room as his superficial bride. His own shallow vanity had literally cost him his freedom. "Dad, please, I am so sorry," Connor wailed, sliding awkwardly out of the metal chair and falling to his knees on the hard linoleum floor. The detective at the door tensed, preparing to intervene, but I held up a hand signaling him to wait. Connor pressed his forehead against the cold edge of the steel table. "I was wrong. I was so wrong. Vanessa poisoned my mind, Dad. She made me feel like I was nothing unless I had money. She demanded the cars and the jewelry. She threatened to leave me if I did not keep up with her father. I will undo it all. I swear to you, I will end it today. I will sign annulment papers right now. I will divorce her before the sun goes down. I will come work for you at the warehouse. I will push brooms. I will load pallets on the night shift. Just please give me that second chance. Please do not let me rot in a prison cell. I am begging you." He was a hollow shell, offering to betray the woman he had just ruined his life to impress all to save his own skin. There was no honor in his plea. There was only the desperate animal instinct of a coward cornered by his own consequences. Before I could deliver my final refusal, a sharp, distinct chime cut through the heavy, miserable air of the interrogation room. It was not a text message. It was a high-priority security alert. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my smartphone. The screen was glowing bright red, displaying an automated emergency notification from my offshore private banking institution. I stared at the text on the screen. My eyes narrowed as I processed the information. Winston noticed the shift in my posture. "Is there a complication, Malcolm?" he asked quietly, leaning closer. I kept my eyes on this glowing screen. "Someone has just successfully bypassed the primary security wall on my restricted offshore emergency account." I stated the temperature in the room dropping drastically. "An authorized wire transfer of $200,000 is currently pending initiation." Connor stopped sobbing. He looked up from the floor, his face a mask of total confusion. "A wire transfer? How?" "I do not have access to any of your offshore accounts, Dad. You revoked all my credentials last night. I am sitting right here in handcuffs. I know you are not initiating the transfer, Connor." I replied, my mind rapidly connecting the tactical pieces of this new threat. "You do not have the technical competence to bypass a two-factor authentication protocol. But someone else currently possesses your laptop. Someone who was sitting inside your luxury condo when the eviction notice was delivered. Someone who just watched her entire family fortune evaporate in a driveway and realizes she needs a massive influx of untraceable cash to flee the wreckage." Connor's eyes widened in absolute horror as the realization hit him. "Vanessa." He whispered the name slipping from his lips like a curse. I left my laptop open on the kitchen counter when I ran out to your house in the rain. She knows my master passwords. She watched me try to access your network last month. She is not just leaving you, Connor," I said, standing up slowly from the steel table, the cold reality of the situation hardening my resolve. "She is attempting to gut the last hidden emergency reserve we possess before she runs." I turned toward the detective standing at the door. "I need to use my phone to contact federal bank fraud investigators immediately. And I need a patrol unit dispatched to my son downtown condo right now." The war was not over. The ultimate betrayal had just shifted targets. Vanessa was making her final desperate run, and I had absolutely no intention of letting her escape into the shadows. I did not wait to hear Connor beg for his freedom or offer his hollow promises. The moment the security alert flashed across my phone screen, I turned my back on the interrogation room and walked out into the sterile corridor of the precinct. I left Winston sitting at the steel table to manage the wreckage of my son. My heavy boots echoed against the linoleum floor as I pushed through the heavy glass double doors and stepped out into the damp afternoon air. I climbed into the cab of my truck and started the engine. The rusted Ford rumbled to life, a steady, reliable sound that contrasted sharply with the chaotic greed tearing my family apart. I pulled my phone from my pocket and dialed a direct line to the local precinct dispatcher. I gave them the address of the downtown high-rise and calmly informed them that a federal wire fraud was currently in progress. Then I put the truck in gear and drove toward the city skyline. The drive took exactly 14 minutes. I did not speed. I did not run any red lights. I drove with the absolute precision of a man who knew the trap was already set and the prey was blindly wandering into it. I pulled up to the curb outside the towering glass structure. The valet rushed forward, looking confused by the battered pickup truck idling in the loading zone reserved for imported sports cars. I handed him the keys and walked straight through the revolving glass doors. The lobby was lined with imported marble and polished brass, a monument to the very vanity that had poisoned my son. I bypassed the front desk completely and stepped into the private elevator. I pressed the button for the penthouse floor. I bought this property 5 years ago through a Vanguard Logistics shell company. I purchased it outright in cash. I gave Connor the keys when he landed his first junior executive job, hoping the responsibility of maintaining a beautiful home would ground him. Instead, he treated it like a stage set to project a fabricated illusion of immense wealth to people who did not care about him. The elevator doors slid open with a soft chime. I walked down the quiet carpeted hallway and stopped in front of the heavy oak double doors. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a simple brass master key. I slid it into the lock and turned it. The deadbolt clicked open with a heavy thud. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The luxury condo looked as if it had been struck by a violent hurricane. The pristine white leather sofas were covered in discarded designer dresses, silk scarves, and expensive shoes. Velvet jewelry boxes had been ripped open, their contents hastily dumped into leather duffel bags sitting on the floor. Drawers were pulled entirely out of their custom cabinets, spilling expensive watches and silver cufflinks across the imported hardwood floors. Vanessa was not packing. She was standing at the massive quartz kitchen island, hunched aggressively over the laptop that belonged to Connor. Her fingers were flying across the keyboard in a frantic, desperate rhythm. Her hair was completely disheveled, her expensive makeup running down her cheeks in dark streaks. She was hyperventilating, staring at the glowing screen with wide, hungry eyes as she navigated the complex security layers of my offshore account. She had stolen the laptop from Connor's desk before fleeing the house, fully intending to gut the final $200,000 of emergency funds before disappearing. "You are typing the wrong routing number." My voice was quiet, but it cut through the silence of the ransacked condo like a sharp blade. Vanessa screamed. She violently jolted away from the kitchen island, her arm knocking a crystal bowl off the counter. It shattered into 100 pieces on the hardwood floor. She spun around to face me, her chest heaving, her eyes wide with absolute terror. She looked like a cornered animal realizing the exit was permanently sealed. "Malcolm!" She gasped, her voice trembling violently as she took a step backward. What are you doing here? How did you get in? I own the building, I replied, walking slowly into the living room, my heavy boots crushing the shards of broken crystal. And I own the server you are desperately trying to hack into. Vanessa looked from me to the laptop, then back to me. The terror in her eyes rapidly morphed into a vicious, cornered rage. The carefully crafted mask of the elegant high society bride completely melted away, revealing the hollow, desperate parasite underneath. She grabbed a heavy water-filled glass vase from the center of the dining table. "You did this!" Vanessa shrieked at the top of her lungs, her voice echoing shrilly off the high ceilings. "You ruined everything. My father is bankrupt because of you. My wedding is a complete disaster because of you. I deserve compensation. I deserve this money for wasting 2 years of my life with a pathetic truck driver son." She pulled her arm back and hurled the heavy glass vase directly at my head with all the strength she possessed. I did not flinch. I did not raise my arms to defend myself. I merely shifted my weight a fraction of an inch to the right. The vase sailed past my shoulder and violently smashed against the pristine white wall behind me. Water and thick shards of heavy glass rained down on the carpet. "I earned that money!" Vanessa screamed, spit flying from her lips as she pointed a shaking finger at the laptop screen. "I endured your miserable family. I endured Connor and his pathetic need for approval. That $200,000 is my severance package. You owe me that money for wasting my life." I stopped walking. I stood perfectly still amidst the wreckage of their fabricated life. I looked at the woman my son had been willing to throw away his freedom to impress. She was completely hollow, entirely defined by the balance of a bank account she did not earn. I reached into the front pocket of my jacket. I did not pull out a phone. I pulled out a small encrypted digital key fob. It was the master override switch for the corporate network, a physical kill switch designed to instantly sever all external server connections in the event of a catastrophic security breach. "You earned absolutely nothing," I stated, my voice carrying the unyielding weight of absolute truth. "And you will leave this property with exactly what you brought into it." I pressed the heavy black button on the remote. Behind Vanessa, the laptop screen instantly froze. A bright red error message flashed across the monitor, signaling a total network lockout. Then the screen went completely black. The digital connection was permanently severed. The $200,000 she was seconds away from stealing was instantly locked behind a wall of military-grade encryption she could never penetrate. "No!" Vanessa shrieked, spinning around and slamming her hands onto the keyboard. "No, no, no, turn it back on. Turn it back on right now. You cannot do this to me. I need that money to leave. You owe me that money." She pounded her fists against the dead keyboard, sobbing hysterically as the reality of her total ruin crashed down upon her. She was bankrupt, entirely alone and completely trapped. Heavy synchronized footsteps echoed in the hallway outside the open double doors. Vanessa froze, her hands hovering above the useless laptop. She slowly turned her head toward the entrance. 2 uniformed police officers stepped into the condo, their hands resting cautiously on their duty belts as they surveyed the shattered glass and the ransacked room. I calmly stepped aside, clearing the path between the officers and the kitchen island. "Officers," I said, keeping my voice perfectly level. "The individual standing at the counter just attempted to wire $200,000 from a restricted corporate account without authorization. The laptop she is using belongs to my son, and the network logs will clearly show a fraudulent breach originating from this exact location 3 minutes ago." The lead officer nodded, his eyes locking onto Vanessa. He unclipped his handcuffs and began walking slowly toward the kitchen. Vanessa backed away, hitting the edge of the quartz counter. "Wait!" she cried out, holding her hands up in front of her. "Wait, this is a misunderstanding. I was just transferring my own wedding funds." "He is lying. He is a bitter old man trying to ruin me. Turn around and place your hands behind your back," the officer commanded, his tone leaving absolutely no room for negotiation. "You are being detained on suspicion of attempted federal wire fraud." Vanessa began to violently thrash as the officer grabbed her wrist. She kicked out her expensive shoes, slipping on the hardwood floor, screaming obscenities at the top of her lungs. The second officer rushed forward to assist, pinning her arms behind her back and forcing the cold steel cuffs shut around her wrists. Her manicured nails scraped helplessly against the metal. As they marched her toward the door, Vanessa locked eyes with me one last time. Her face was twisted into a mask of pure, unrestrained hatred, tears of absolute defeat streaming down her cheeks. She had tried to steal my money, burn my son's life to the ground, and escape into the luxury she felt entitled to. Instead, she was leaving in handcuffs, stripped of her fake wealth, her fraudulent status, and her freedom. I watched the officers guide her into the hallway and out of sight. I stood alone in the quiet wreckage of the condo, the only sound left being the soft hum of the city traffic far below. The infection had finally been cut out. Now it was time to tear down the rest of the rot. 3 days had passed since the digital guillotine dropped on Vanessa. The air in the city was crisp and sharp as I stepped out of my truck. I stood on the pristine pavement outside the towering glass and steel monolith that served as the corporate headquarters for Blake Commercial Properties. The building was a monument to excess. Its facade mirrored the clouds but hid the rotting foundation within. I smoothed the collar of my faded denim jacket. I adjusted my steel-toed boots. I did not belong in this world of marble lobbies and imported leather furniture. I belonged in the warehouses and on the freight docks. But today I was not here to haul cargo. I was here to haul out the trash. Winston Pierce stood beside me. His dark navy suit was immaculate. His silver glasses caught the morning sun. Behind him stood a phalanx of 6 federal auditors. They wore identical gray suits and carried heavy reinforced briefcases. They moved with the synchronized precision of an invading army. We walked through the revolving glass doors. The lobby security guard stood up immediately, attempting to block our path. He took one look at Winston and the team of federal agents and slowly sat back down, picking up his desk phone with a trembling hand. We bypassed the reception desk entirely and stepped into the private executive elevator. The ride to the top floor was silent. The only sound was the soft hum of the cables pulling us toward the ultimate reckoning. I stared at the brass numbers above the door as they ticked upward. 51, 52, 53, the penthouse level. Douglas Blake had spent his entire life looking down on people from this exact height. He believed altitude equated to superiority. Today, he was going to learn about gravity. The elevator doors slid open, with a soft chime revealing a sprawling reception area decorated with abstract art and frosted glass partitions. But the usual hushed professional atmosphere was gone. It had been replaced by the frantic mechanical whine of a heavy-duty industrial paper shredder running at maximum capacity. The sound echoed down the hallway like a dying animal. I walked past the empty reception desk. The administrative assistants had already fled, sensing the impending collapse. I turned the corner and stepped into the main executive corridor. Douglas Blake was standing in his sprawling corner office. He was completely unrecognizable from the arrogant aristocrat who had marched onto my front porch 3 days prior. His suit jacket was thrown carelessly onto a leather sofa. His expensive silk tie was hanging loosely around his neck. His shirt was completely soaked in sweat, sticking to his back in dark patches. He was frantically shoving thick stacks of financial ledgers into the mouth of the massive shredder. The machine was overheating, emitting a sharp, acrid smell of burning dust and hot plastic. He was trying to erase the paper trail of his toxic loans, his illegal leverage, and his fraudulent accounting. He was trying to destroy the evidence before the inevitable arrived. He did not realize the inevitable was already standing in his doorway. I walked across the plush carpet. I reached down and grabbed the thick black power cord connecting the shredder to the wall outlet. I ripped it out of the socket with a single sharp pull. The machine whirred down, grinding to a sluggish, pathetic halt. A half-shredded financial statement stuck out of its metal teeth like a mocking tongue. Douglas spun around, gasping for air. His eyes were wide and bloodshot. His hands were covered in paper cuts and black ink. When he saw me standing there in my work clothes, his entire body seized. He looked at Winston and the line of federal auditors filing into his office behind me. The color drained from his face, leaving him looking like a sick, terrified ghost. "What are you doing here?" Douglas demanded, his voice cracking into a high-pitched, desperate squeal. "This is private property. You are trespassing. Get out of my office before I call building security." I looked at the panicked man. I looked at the mounds of shredded paper filling the clear plastic bins. "You no longer have an office, Douglas," I said, my voice perfectly calm and devoid of any sympathy. "You no longer have building security. In fact, as of exactly 9:02 this morning, you no longer own this building." Douglas shook his head violently, stepping backward until he bumped against the floor-to-ceiling window overlooking the city. "You are lying." He spat out drops of sweat rolling down his forehead. "I have an extension. My lawyers filed an emergency motion to block the foreclosure. You cannot just walk in here and take my company." Winston stepped forward, opening his leather folio. "Your lawyers resigned last night, Mr. Blake." Winston stated, his tone clinical and completely merciless. "They abandoned your firm the moment our forensic accountants provided them with undeniable proof of your massive corporate fraud. The emergency motion was dismissed by a federal judge an hour ago. Vanguard Logistics now holds the primary deed to this building and every single asset within it. You are currently standing on my client property and destroying my client financial records. That is a federal offense." Douglas collapsed against the glass, clutching his chest. But the execution was not over. Down the hall, the heavy glass doors of the main conference room swung open. The board of directors had been gathering for an emergency meeting, desperately trying to figure out how to save their exorbitant salaries. 6 men and 2 women, all dressed in pristine tailored suits, stepped out into the hallway drawn by the commotion. They stared at me and my team of auditors with a mixture of confusion and mounting dread. I did not wait for introductions. I walked out of Douglas' office and strode directly down the hallway toward the gathered executives. They instinctively parted, making a path for me as I stepped into the center of their opulent conference room. The mahogany table was polished to a mirror shine. The leather chairs cost more than most working families made in a month. I stood at the head of the table. Winston stood to my right, and the federal auditors fanned out across the room, immediately seizing the laptops and physical files left on the table. "Who is in charge here?" An older man with silver hair demanded, stepping forward. "You cannot just confiscate our property. We are the board of directors for Blake Commercial Properties." "Not anymore," I replied, keeping my voice flat and unyielding. "You are officially terminated, effective immediately." The room erupted into chaotic shouting. The executives began protesting, waving their arms and threatening massive lawsuits. They demanded to speak to their legal counsel. They demanded severance packages. They demanded respect. I stood in total silence, letting their panicked entitlement wash over me. When they finally realized I was not reacting to their hollow threats, the shouting slowly died down, leaving only a tense, suffocating silence. "You enabled him," I said, looking directly into the eyes of the silver-haired man. "You sat at this expensive table for 5 years and rubber-stamped every single piece of toxic debt Douglas Blake brought to you. You approved predatory loans. You falsified liquidity reports to secure your massive year-end bonuses. You built your entire elite lifestyle by bankrupting the foundation of this firm. You thought you were untouchable because you hid behind a wall of corporate jargon and shell companies. But my team spent the last 72 hours tracing every single dime. We know exactly where the money went." I pointed to the federal auditors who were meticulously logging the confiscated electronics. "These individuals are not private accountants. They are federal agents. They are currently securing all physical and digital assets for a comprehensive criminal investigation. If you leave this building quietly right now and cooperate fully with the authorities, you might avoid federal prison. If you attempt to take a single pen or a single piece of paper from this room, I will personally ensure you are indicted for corporate espionage by the end of the day." The threat was absolute and undeniable. The wealthy, arrogant board members looked at the auditors. They looked at the heavy briefcases and the cold, mechanical efficiency of the seizure. The reality of their total ruin crushed their defiant spirits. No one said another word. The silver-haired man lowered his head, turned around, and walked out of the conference room. One by one, the rest of the corrupt board followed him. They filed out into the hallway, abandoning their luxury briefcases and expensive coats, fleeing the sinking ship they had spent years drilling holes into. The hostile takeover of the entire executive tier took exactly 5 minutes. I walked back down the hallway to Douglas' office. The space was eerily quiet now. The shredder was dead. The federal auditors were methodically bagging the shredded documents for reconstruction. Douglas Blake was still standing by the window, staring out at the city he used to believe he owned. He turned around as I entered. The complete psychological collapse of the man was staggering to witness. His face was gray and sagging. The false bravado, the posturing, the elite arrogance had been entirely stripped away, leaving only a pathetic, terrified shell. His knees buckled. Douglas Blake, the man who had shoved a finger into my chest and threatened to steal my pension, literally fell to his knees on the plush carpet. He scrambled forward, crawling over the discarded papers until he reached my steel-toed boots. He looked up at me, tears streaming down his face, his hands clasped together in desperate supplication. "Malcolm, please." Douglas begged, his voice a wet, pathetic whisper. "Please do not do this to me. You took my company. You took my assets. You fired my entire board. I have absolutely nothing left. My wife will leave me. I will be ruined in the society pages. They will revoke my country club membership. I will be a laughingstock. Please, Malcolm, I am begging you on my hands and knees. Give me a position, any position. Let me stay on as a middle management consultant. Let me keep my title just for appearances. Let me retain my club membership. I cannot face the world as a failure. I will do whatever you want. I will answer directly to you. Just please save my reputation." I looked down at the weeping man clinging to the fabric of my jeans. He was not begging for his family. He was not begging for a way to feed himself. He was literally sobbing over the loss of his country club membership and his fragile social reputation. He had learned absolutely nothing. His vanity was a terminal disease. I stepped back, forcing him to let go of my legs. I walked out of the office and into the hallway. A custodian cart had been abandoned by the elevators when the panic started. I grabbed a standard industrial mop with a wooden handle and a yellow plastic bucket on wheels. I rolled the bucket down the carpeted hallway and pushed it directly into Douglas' office. It bumped against his knees. The dirty mop water sloshed against the pristine plastic. I pulled the mop from the bucket and dropped it onto the floor right in front of him. The wet strings slapped against the expensive carpet. "You want a position, Douglas?" I asked, staring down at his tear-stained face. "You want a way to maintain your employment status under Vanguard Logistics? There is your equipment. You can start by cleaning up the mess you made in this office. Then you can work your way down to the lobby. The pay is minimum wage and you will clock in at 5 in the morning." Douglas stared at the dirty mop. He looked at the yellow bucket. His entire body began to tremble. "I do not negotiate with parasites." I continued, my voice echoing cold and hard against the glass walls. "And I do not care about your social reputation. You built a kingdom on lies and theft. You looked down on the working class your entire life. You mocked the very labor that built this country because you thought your tailored suit made you superior. Well, Douglas, the suit is gone. The money is gone. The country club is gone. The only thing you have left is the opportunity to earn an honest dollar with your own 2 hands. Pick up the mop. Blue-collar work builds character." The ultimate humiliation finally snapped whatever fragile thread of sanity Douglas had left. He did not reach for the mop. He let out a primal guttural scream of pure, unadulterated rage. He scrambled up from his knees, launching himself forward like a rabid animal. His hands stretched out, aiming directly for my throat. He was entirely consumed by the blinding, violent realization that a truck driver had systematically destroyed his entire aristocratic existence. He never even made contact. I did not need to step back. I did not need to raise my fists. Before Douglas could even cross the distance, the two federal agents standing near the shredder moved with terrifying speed. They stepped perfectly into his path, grabbing him by the shoulders and slamming him violently face first against his own polished mahogany desk. The heavy thud shook the entire room. Douglas screamed, thrashing wildly against their grip, but they pinned him down with absolute, overwhelming force. "Douglas Blake, you are under arrest for assault on a federal witness and resisting a lawful federal seizure." An agent stated, his voice barking out the Miranda rights as he yanked Douglas' arms painfully behind his back. The sharp, heavy metallic snap of the handcuffs echoed through the penthouse suite, finalizing the absolute destruction of his elite empire. I stood perfectly still, watching as they hauled him up from the desk. His expensive shirt was torn. His face was red and contorted with fury. He spat curses and screamed threats as the agents dragged him out of the office and down the long corridor toward the elevators. The sound of his frantic, hysterical shouting faded as the heavy steel doors closed behind him, dragging him down to the street level to face the cold, harsh reality of the concrete. I turned back to the room. The air was clear. The toxic rot had been excised from the top down. I looked at Winston, who was quietly observing the empty space. The house of cards had completely collapsed. The heavy steel doors of the county correctional facility slammed shut behind me. The sound echoed down the long, sterile concrete corridor like a gunshot. The air inside the visiting room was stale and heavy, tasting of industrial bleach and stagnant despair. I walked across the scuffed linoleum floor and sat down on a hard plastic chair bolted permanently to the ground. I stared through the thick, smudged, bulletproof glass partition that separated the free world from the cages. I folded my hands on the cold metal counter, and I waited for my son. 3 days had passed since the catastrophe on my front lawn. 3 days since Vanessa was hauled away in handcuffs from the luxury penthouse. 3 days since Douglas Blake lost his entire corporate empire in a matter of minutes. Now it was time to finalize the last remaining piece of business. A heavy reinforced door on the opposite side of the glass buzzed loudly. A corrections officer escorted Connor into the small visitor booth. The physical transformation was absolute. The custom-tailored Italian tuxedo was gone. The imported silk ties and the $1,000 haircut had been entirely erased by 72 hours in county lockup. Connor was drowning in a baggy fluorescent orange jumpsuit. The fabric was stiff and cheap. His wrists were bare, completely stripped of the heavy platinum watch he used to flash at high society dinners to prove his worth. He looked incredibly small. He looked fragile. He looked exactly like a man who had finally crashed headfirst into the concrete wall of reality. Connor sat down slowly, picking up the black plastic telephone receiver mounted to the cinder block wall. His hand was trembling so violently he nearly dropped the heavy plastic handset. I picked up my receiver and held it to my ear. I did not speak a single word. I simply let the dull static hum over the secure line. Connor looked at me with bloodshot eyes. Dark purple bags hung heavily under his lower lids. "Dad," he whispered, his voice cracking over the cheap audio connection. "Dad, please get me out of here. It is an absolute nightmare. I cannot sleep. The food is rotten. The people in here are animals. You have to post my bail right now. I will do whatever you want. I will go to rehab. I will go to therapy. I will move back home. Just please write the check and get me out of this cage." I stared at him through the thick glass. He was still trying to negotiate. He was still operating under the arrogant delusion that my money could buy his way out of consequence. He believed that tears and empty promises would unlock the doors, just as they always had when he was a child. "You do not understand what it is like in here, Dad," he sobbed, pressing his free hand against the glass as if trying to reach me. "I do not belong in a place like this. I am your son. Mom would never want this for me. You know she would not. She would be begging you to save me right now. She would want you to bring me home and forgive me." The mention of his mother triggered a cold, blinding flash of absolute rage. I slammed my closed fist against the thick, bulletproof glass with a violent force that shook the metal frame. The loud, sudden crack echoed through the entire visiting room, bouncing off the concrete walls. Connor violently flinched backward, dropping the phone receiver. It dangled by its metal cord, swinging wildly, hitting the wall. The corrections officer stepped forward, putting a hand on his radio, but I held up my hand, signaling that I was done. I waited for Connor to pick the receiver back up. His hands were shaking uncontrollably as he pressed the black plastic to his ear. "Do not ever put words in your mother's mouth," I hissed, my voice dropping to a low, dangerous frequency that commanded total silence. "Do not ever use her sacred memory to justify your pathetic, cowardly actions. You think you know what Evelyn would want. Let me tell you exactly what your mother wanted." Connor swallowed hard, tears streaming down his pale cheeks. He did not dare interrupt me. "When your mother was lying in that hospice bed, hooked up to morphine machines and oxygen tanks, she held my hand and made me promise her one specific thing." I continued stripping away the decades of lies I had told to protect him. "She did not ask me to buy you a luxury penthouse. She did not ask me to buy you imported sports cars or pay for lavish Caribbean vacations. Her dying wish was for me to march you down to the Vanguard Logistics loading docks the very day you turned 18. She wanted me to put a pair of heavy leather work gloves on your hands and make you load freight pallets for a minimum wage paycheck. She wanted you to sweat in the summer heat. She wanted your muscles to ache so badly you could barely stand. She wanted you to learn the profound humility of physical labor so you would never become an arrogant, entitled parasite." I watched the color completely drain from Connor's face. He stared at me, his jaw trembling. "But you never made me do that," he whispered, his voice breaking into a pathetic whine. "You sent me to the private university. You bought me the condo. You gave me the credit cards. I did that because I was weak." I replied, the bitter truth burning the back of my throat. "I could not bear to see you struggle after we buried her. I thought I could shield you from the pain by giving you everything I never had growing up. I bought you the life you wanted because I naively thought it would make you happy. Instead, it turned you into a hollow, selfish fraud who actively despised his own father for wearing denim instead of a tailored suit. You spat on her dying wish every single day you chose to lie and steal to impress people who did not even care about your existence." Connor began to weep openly, burying his face in his hands. The cheap orange fabric of his jumpsuit absorbed his tears. He had no excuses left. Every single defense mechanism he had built to justify his greed was completely shattered. "I did not come here to listen to you cry, Connor," I said, my tone shifting from anger to absolute cold calculation. "I came here to offer you a singular, agonizing choice." I reached into the inner pocket of my jacket and pulled out a thick document folded neatly in thirds. I flattened it out on the metal counter and slid it through the narrow steel slot at the base of the glass partition. The thick paper pushed through to his side of the table, resting near his trembling hands. "Pick it up," I commanded. Connor slowly lowered his hands and picked up the document. He unfolded it, staring blindly at the dense legal text. He asked what it was, wiping his running nose with the sleeve of his jumpsuit. "It is a legally binding declaration of complete disinheritance," I explained, my voice entirely devoid of any parental emotion. "It permanently revokes your status as my son and my legal heir. It actively removes your name from every family trust, every offshore bank account, every life insurance policy, and every corporate asset attached to Vanguard Logistics. It severs our bloodline legally and financially forever. If you sign that paper, you walk away with absolutely nothing, not a single cent. You will be entirely cut off from the wealth you tried to steal." Connor gasped, reading the harsh, unyielding legal language printed on the page. "Dad, you cannot do this," he pleaded, his eyes darting frantically across the text. "You are leaving me with nothing. I will be on the street. I have no money left. I am giving you a choice," I corrected him, cutting off his pathetic protests before they could escalate. "If you sign that document right now, giving up all the future claims to my wealth, I will contact the federal prosecutors before I walk out of this building. I will formally drop the felony forgery and corporate wire fraud charges. Those are severe federal offenses that carry a mandatory 20-year sentence in a maximum security penitentiary. Without my active cooperation, the feds will be forced to reduce your case. You will still face local state charges for grand larceny regarding the funds you already siphoned from my accounts. You will serve 2 or maybe 3 years in a state facility for minor theft. You will do your short time and you will be released as a completely broke, disinherited man forced to start from zero. I leaned closer to the smudged glass, staring directly into his terrified, wide eyes. But if you refuse to sign that paper, I continued, letting the threat hang heavy in the sterile air. If you decide to cling to the arrogant delusion that you are still entitled to my money, I will let the federal prosecutors bury you alive. I will hand over every piece of digital evidence, every forged document, every bank statement, and every high-definition surveillance video I possess. They will lock you in a federal penitentiary for the next 2 decades. You will be an old, broken man by the time you see a blue sky without barbed wire blocking your view. The choice is entirely yours, Connor. 2 years as a nobody or 20 years as a federal inmate. Connor stared at the document. The tears dripped off his chin, staining the thick legal paper. He looked up at me, searching my stoic face for any sign of a bluff, any hidden hint of paternal mercy. He found absolutely nothing. The silence stretched between us, thick and suffocating. He realized in that exact moment that the endless well of my forgiveness had finally run completely dry. There would be no more blank checks. There would be no more last-minute rescues. I was dead to him as a resource, and he was dead to me as a son. He reached with a trembling hand for the cheap plastic pen chained to the metal table. His fingers shook so badly he could barely grip the plastic barrel. He pressed the pen to the signature line at the bottom of the page. He did not hesitate any longer. The raw, primal survival instinct of a cornered coward easily overrode his desperate greed. He scrawled his signature across the paper, permanently signing away the lavish future he had committed multiple felonies to secure. He pushed the document back through the narrow metal slot. I pulled the paper through, folding it carefully and returning it to the inside pocket of my denim jacket. The natural order had been restored. The toxic entitlement had been severed at the root. I did not say another word. I hung the black receiver back on the metal wall hook. The line went dead. I stood up from the hard plastic chair. Connor pressed his hands flat against the bulletproof glass, weeping loudly, his mouth moving rapidly as he begged me not to leave him alone. I could not hear his voice through the thick barrier. I turned my back on the sterile glass booth and walked slowly toward the heavy steel exit doors. I did not look back. The loud mechanical clank of the heavy locks engaging echoed down the hallway, sealing him inside the concrete tomb of his own creation. I stepped out into the bright afternoon sun, breathing in the clean air, finally free of the parasite that had haunted my life. Connor stared down at the cheap plastic pen lying on the scarred metal counter. It was a flimsy, clear tube filled with black ink attached to a thick metal chain bolted directly to the cinderblock wall. He had spent the last 5 years signing restaurant receipts and luxury car leases with heavy gold fountain pens that cost more than a month of groceries. He had cultivated an image of absolute superiority, presenting himself as an untouchable aristocrat who only touched the finest materials the world had to offer. Now his entire future rested on a piece of plastic worth less than 10 cents. He did not reach for it immediately. His eyes flickered up, searching my face through the smudged bulletproof glass. He was looking for a crack in my armor. He was desperately searching for the father who had spent decades bailing him out of trouble, the man who had worked through the night to ensure his child never went without a hot meal or a warm bed. He found a completely empty void. My posture did not shift. My breathing remained perfectly slow and measured. The absolute silence in the visitation booth became a physical weight pressing down on his narrow, trembling shoulders. He realized in that agonizing stretch of quiet that the wall between us was no longer just reinforced glass and steel frames. It was an unbreakable barrier of my own deliberate design. I had completely closed the door on his manipulation. There would be no 11th hour rescue. There would be no paternal embrace. The unconditional love he had exploited for his own selfish gain had been permanently extinguished. The final shreds of his fabricated arrogance dissolved into the stale prison air. His chest heaved as a fresh wave of tears spilled over his lower lids, tracking through the grime and dried sweat on his pale face. The realization hit him with the force of a speeding freight train. There was no secret loophole waiting to be discovered. There was no hidden legal strategy that Vanessa or her bankrupt father could provide to save him. His mother was gone, and his father was entirely dead to him. He was completely trapped by the harsh, unyielding consequences of his own boundless greed. He raised his trembling right hand and let his fingers wrap around the cheap plastic barrel of the pen. His knuckles turned stark white as he gripped it. The metal chain rattled softly against the counter, a pathetic, hollow sound that marked the definitive end of his lavish existence. He looked down at the dense legal text printed on the heavy stock paper. It was a masterpiece of legal termination drafted by Winston to ensure there was absolutely no room for future litigation or contestation. By signing his name on the dotted line at the bottom of the page, Connor was actively erasing his own legacy. He was willingly stripping himself of a multi-million-dollar logistics empire he had arrogantly believed was his untouchable birthright. A loud, ragged sob ripped from his throat as he pressed the pen tip to the paper. The cheap ballpoint scratched harshly against the document. He wrote his first name, his hand shaking so violently the letters looked jagged and broken like the frantic scribbling of a terrified child. He paused, leaving a dark pool of black ink resting on the paper. He closed his eyes tightly, fighting against the devastating reality of what he was doing. He was signing away his penthouse, his sports cars, his tailored suits, and his elite status in a single stroke. But the dark looming threat of 20 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary hung over his head like a descending guillotine blade. He opened his eyes and finished the signature crossing the final letter of our shared last name. It was the very last time that name would carry any weight or value for him in the corporate world. He dropped the pen as if the plastic barrel had suddenly burned his skin. It swung wildly on its metal chain, hitting the concrete block wall with a rhythmic, hollow tap. He pushed the document forward, sliding it through the narrow steel slot at the base of the glass partition. I watched the thick paper slide onto my side of the counter. I reached down and picked it up. I did not show any emotion. I did not offer a comforting smile or a sympathetic nod of reassurance. I simply inspected the wet ink, ensuring the signature was clear, legible, and legally binding in the eyes of the court. The transaction was complete. The parasite had officially disconnected himself from the host. I folded the heavy document neatly in thirds and tucked it safely into the inside breast pocket of my faded denim jacket. It rested perfectly against my chest, a silent guarantee that the company I had built with my own blood, sweat, and endless sacrifices would never fall into the hands of a spoiled thief. I placed my hands flat on the cold metal counter and pushed myself up from the hard plastic chair. The screech of the chair legs dragging against the scuffed linoleum echoed sharply in the small confined room. I buttoned my jacket and turned my body, preparing to walk away from my son for the very last time. I had no intention of looking back. The monumental debt was settled. The natural order of consequence and reward had been brutally but effectively restored. I took a step toward the heavy steel exit door. Wait. The word was incredibly faint, muffled by the thick barrier separating the free world from the cages. I stopped moving. I did not turn around completely, but I shifted my head just enough to look at him over my shoulder. Connor was pressing his hands flat against the glass, his face contorted in a mask of absolute misery and desperate curiosity. He was staring directly at the pocket where I had placed the disinheritance form. The tears were still flowing freely down his neck, but a new burning question had momentarily pierced through his overwhelming grief. "What are you going to do with it?" Connor asked, his voice barely loud enough to penetrate the heavy glass pane. "The money. The company. All of it. What are you going to do with the empire now that I am permanently gone?" He could not fathom a world where vast wealth existed without someone exactly like him to recklessly spend it. His mind was so deeply corrupted by the toxic illusion of high society that he genuinely could not understand what an old truck driver would do with a multi-million-dollar corporate entity now that the designated heir had been officially erased from the ledger. He likely thought I would sell it to a massive faceless conglomerate. He probably assumed I would liquidate the thousands of physical assets and hoard the cash out of sheer spiteful vengeance. He still did not understand the fundamental core value of the empire he had tried to steal. I turned my entire body back to face the glass. I looked directly into his red, swollen eyes. I did not raise my voice. I spoke with a quiet, unyielding clarity that I knew would haunt his every waking thought for the rest of his miserable life. I am giving it to the people who actually built this company, I answered. I am giving it to my drivers. Connor stared at me in total blank confusion. His mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out. The concept was entirely alien to his selfish, aristocratic worldview. I am taking every single share of Vanguard Logistics and transferring it directly to the employees. I explained, allowing the absolute devastating truth of his failure to wash completely over him. The men and women who haul freight through the blinding ice storms. The mechanics who bust their knuckles and ruin their backs, keeping the heavy diesel rigs on the highway. The dispatchers who work the grueling graveyard shift so you could afford to drink expensive imported champagne on a random Tuesday afternoon. They are the ones who bled for that money, Connor. They are the ones who truly earned it. They are the ones who deserve to own the empire outright. I watched the crushing reality of my words sink deep into his corrupted mind. He had thrown away his entire life to impress a superficial woman who actively despised the working class. He had banned his own father from his wedding simply to maintain a lie. Now the very wealth he had committed multiple felonies to steal was being handed over entirely to the blue-collar workers he had spent his whole pathetic life looking down upon. The poetic justice of his absolute downfall was finally complete. I did not wait for him to respond. I did not wait for another useless round of pathetic apologies or desperate hollow bargaining. I turned my back on the glass partition and walked purposefully toward the heavy steel exit door. The corrections officer standing silently by the wall stepped forward and pushed the heavy metal handle down. The door swung open, revealing the long, quiet concrete corridor leading back out to the free world. Dad, Connor screamed. His voice was a muffled, distant wail, bouncing helplessly against the thick, bulletproof glass. Dad, please do not leave me here. I stepped through this doorway. I did not stop. I did not hesitate. The heavy steel door swung shut behind me with a thunderous metallic boom. The heavy deadbolts engaged instantly, locking securely into place. The final sound echoed down the long hallway, sealing my former son in the cold, unforgiving silence of the visiting room. He was finally exactly where he belonged. And I was finally free. The break room at Vanguard Logistics smelled of burnt coffee and heavy diesel exhaust. It was a scent I had known for 40 years. It was the smell of survival and honest labor. I sat at a scratched folding table in the far corner of the room. I was wearing my faded denim jacket and my scuffed steel-toed boots. I ran my calloused thumb over the jagged edge of the cheap plastic table. This room was a world away from the imported marble lobbies and the luxury penthouses I had spent the last 72 hours systematically dismantling. This small, grimy room was the actual beating heart of the empire my son had arrogantly believed was his untouchable birthright. The morning shift change was in full swing. The heavy steel doors swung open and shut as drivers and warehouse staff filtered in from the freezing loading docks. These were men and women with dirt under their fingernails and deep, permanent lines of exhaustion etched into their faces. I watched Thomas walk in, rubbing his lower back with a grimace. He had been driving for me for 22 years. I remembered the winter of 2012 when his rig blew a transmission outside Denver. Thomas had stayed inside the freezing cab for 3 days in sub-zero temperatures, refusing to abandon a highly sensitive medical shipment. He never complained. He simply did the job. I watched Maria pour a cup of bitter black coffee from the communal pot. She managed the dispatch logistics, working grueling 14-hour graveyard shifts. Years ago, she had worked 2 full-time jobs to pay for her husband's medical treatments before he passed away. She had never asked me for a loan or a handout. She had simply asked for more overtime shifts. These people did not wear bespoke Italian suits. They did not drink imported champagne or attend high-society charity galas. They did not care about the superficial status that Vanessa had weaponized to poison my son. They were the absolute unshakable foundation of my wealth. Connor had looked down on these people. He had treated them as invisible, uneducated peasants who existed solely to generate the massive revenue he needed to fund his lavish Caribbean vacations and hide his predatory loans. He had been thoroughly embarrassed by the grease on my hands and the grit on my boots. He did not understand that the dirt was the literal proof of our labor. He did not understand that real power did not reside in a country club membership, but in the unyielding loyalty of the people who bled alongside you. I reached down to the floor next to my boots. I picked up a heavy cardboard banker box and placed it squarely on the scratched laminate table. The dull, heavy thud drew the attention of the entire room. The loud, overlapping chatter and the scraping of metal chairs slowly died down. 40 men and women turned to look at me. They saw the owner of the company sitting among them, not as a distant corporate overlord, but as a man who still carried a valid commercial driver's license in his wallet. I opened the cardboard box. Inside were 40 thick manila envelopes perfectly organized and sealed. I did not stand up. I did not ask for their attention or prepare a long-winded self-congratulatory speech. The time for useless words was over. I simply pulled the first envelope from the front of the stack and read the name printed in bold black ink across the front. Thomas. I said, my voice carrying easily across the dead quiet break room. Thomas blinked in surprise, setting his coffee mug down on the counter. He wiped his greasy hands on his faded denim jeans and walked slowly across the room. He stopped in front of the table, looking down at me with a mixture of deep respect and quiet confusion. I held out the heavy envelope. He took it, his rough fingers brushing against the smooth paper. Maria. I called out, pulling the second envelope from the box. She stepped forward, her heavy work boots scuffing against the linoleum floor. I handed her the package with a brief nod. I continued down the line, calling out name after name. David, Marcus, Samuel, Elena, the veteran drivers, the forklift operators, the night shift supervisors, and the loading dock foreman. Every single person who had given their youth and their physical strength to build Vanguard Logistics from a single rusted truck into a multi-million-dollar empire stepped forward to receive their envelope. I sat back in my metal folding chair as the very last envelope was handed out. The room was perfectly silent, save for the heavy breathing of tired workers holding their unsealed packages. I looked around the room, making eye contact with the people who had kept me afloat when my wife passed away. Open them, I instructed quietly. 40 thick paper seals were torn open simultaneously. The sound of ripping paper filled the air like a sudden rush of heavy wind. I watched Thomas pull a thick stack of legal documents from his envelope. He stared at the first page, his brow furrowing, as he tried to process the dense legal text printed on the heavy stock paper. His eyes widened drastically. He flipped to the second page and his breath hitched loudly in his throat. Boss. Thomas whispered, his voice trembling as he looked up from the papers. This is the deed to my house. It is, I replied, maintaining my steady gaze. And if you look at the attached bank notice, you will see that your mortgage has been paid in full as of 9 o'clock this morning. You own your home outright, Thomas. The bank no longer owns a single brick of your property. A collective gasp rippled through the break room. Maria dropped her empty envelope onto the floor, covering her mouth with both hands, as hot tears instantly flooded her eyes. Marcus let out a choked sob, leaning heavily against the glass front of the vending machine to keep his balance. Every single envelope in that room contained the exact same salvation. I had liquidated the massive offshore accounts that Vanessa had desperately tried to hack before her arrest. I had taken the hundreds of thousands of dollars Connor had attempted to steal through his pathetic corporate forgery. I had taken the vast wealth that my son had intended to squander on vanity and luxury, and I had channeled every single cent of that toxic hoarded cash directly into the hands of the people who actually deserved it. But the deeds were only the beginning. I waited for the initial wave of shock to settle before I spoke again. "Look at the final document in the stack," I told them. Thomas wiped a stray tear from his lined cheek and pulled out the very last piece of paper. It was a heavily embossed certificate bearing the official corporate seal of Vanguard Logistics. "For the last 30 years, I have held 100% ownership of this company," I explained, my voice perfectly calm, echoing in the absolute silence of the room. "My son believed he was the sole heir to this empire. He believed he was entitled to the fruits of your grueling labor simply because he shared my last name. He was entirely wrong. The people who bleed for a company are the only ones who deserve to own it." The disinheritance document he signed in the county jail yesterday cleared the final legal hurdle. "As of this morning, I have restructured Vanguard Logistics into an employee-owned cooperative. Those certificates you are holding represent a massive legal transfer of corporate stock. You do not just work here anymore. You own this fleet. You own these warehouses. The profits you generate will no longer fund the luxury lifestyle of an arrogant parasite. They will fund your retirements and your children's college tuitions." The profound gravity of the moment crushed the remaining air out of the room. These were men and women who had lived paycheck to paycheck their entire adult lives. They had worried constantly about medical bills and rising heating costs. They had prayed their aging personal vehicles would not break down before payday. In a matter of 5 short minutes, I had permanently erased their financial terror and handed them the keys to a multi-million-dollar kingdom. Thomas took a slow, unsteady step forward. He did not say a single word. He simply reached out his large, battered hand. I stood up from the folding chair and grasped his hand firmly. His grip was strong and calloused, built from decades of gripping a heavy steering wheel on icy highways. We shook hands in total silence. A profound, unbreakable respect passed between us, confirming a bond that no amount of stolen money could ever forge. Maria stepped forward next, wrapping her arms around my neck in a tight, desperate embrace. She wept openly against my denim jacket, soaking the rough fabric with tears of pure, raw gratitude. One by one, the entire crew approached the table. There were no long-winded emotional speeches. There were no grand declarations of corporate loyalty. There were only quiet nods, firm handshakes, and tears of absolute profound relief. They understood exactly what had happened. The wealth had finally been returned to the soil that grew it. I picked up the empty cardboard box. I looked at the sea of exhausted, grateful faces surrounding me. The staggering weight of the past month, the betrayal, the forgery, the heartbreaking realization of my son, deep corruption, finally began to lift from my shoulders. The natural order was completely restored. The toxic entitlement had been brutally severed and replaced by honest, equitable reward. I nodded to Thomas. I nodded to Maria. Then I turned and walked toward the heavy steel exit doors. I pushed them open, stepping out onto the loud, chaotic loading dock. The frigid morning air bit at my face, but it felt incredibly clean. A line of massive diesel trucks stood idling by the loading bays, ready to haul freight across the country. The engines rumbled with a deep, steady vibration that shook the concrete beneath my steel-toed boots. I took a deep breath of the diesel exhaust. The empire was finally in the right hands. I walked down the concrete steps and headed toward my truck, leaving the past entirely behind me. 6 months had passed since I walked out of the county jail and left my former life entirely behind. I sat on the solid oak steps of a remote cabin deep in the wilderness of Montana. The morning air was sharp and freezing, biting at my cheeks, but it felt incredibly clean. There were no sirens here. There were no flashing police lights painting the trees. There were no frantic phone calls from panicked aristocrats or desperate lawyers trying to salvage their ruined empires. There was only the endless expanse of towering green pine trees and the distant steady rush of a clear mountain river. I wore my faded denim jacket and a thick flannel shirt. My steel-toed boots rested heavily on the wooden floorboards. I had purchased this isolated parcel of land 20 years ago, when Evelyn was still alive. We used to sit at our small kitchen table late at night and look at photographs of these mountains. She always said we would build a quiet place here together when my hauling days were finally done. I had finally kept that promise. I built the cabin with my own hands, swinging the heavy hammer and cutting the thick timber. The physical labor had slowly cleared the toxic poison from my mind. The heavy logs of the cabin walls held the warmth of the cast iron stove inside, protecting me from the harsh elements. I chopped my own firewood. I hauled my own water from the nearby stream. There was absolutely no cell service out here. There were no corporate emails and no offshore banking alerts demanding my attention. The digital world that had so thoroughly consumed and destroyed my son simply did not exist in this forest. It was an absolute sanctuary of silence. Down in the valley about 5 miles away, there was a small, rusted metal mailbox resting firmly on a wooden post. Once a week, I would drive my old Ford truck down the winding dirt road to collect whatever correspondence Winston deemed necessary to send me. He was the only person on earth who knew my exact location. I had completely severed my ties to the city. Vanguard Logistics was no longer my burden to carry. Thomas and Maria and the rest of the veteran drivers were running the massive empire now. The monthly financial reports Winston forwarded to me proved that the company was thriving under their careful control. I often thought about Thomas sitting in my old office reviewing freight manifests with the same dedication he used to drive the icy highways. The massive corporate profits were no longer being siphoned off to pay for luxury penthouses or imported sports cars. The money was paying for medical bills and college tuitions for the children of the warehouse workers. The corporate entity had been fully cleansed. The systemic disease of greed had been entirely cured by the medicine of honest, equitable labor. I did not miss the boardroom. I did not miss the offshore bank accounts. I only felt a profound sense of relief, knowing the foundation I built was finally supporting the people who actually deserved to stand on it. This morning I held a single thick manila envelope on my lap. Winston had mailed it via express courier to the local post office. I slid my calloused thumb under the paper flap and tore it open. There was no formal letter inside. Winston understood perfectly that we had moved far beyond the need for lengthy legal explanations. There was only a single newspaper clipping carefully cut from the financial section of a major city publication. The ink was dark and the text was dense. I spread the clipping out on my knee, smoothing the heavy creases with the palm of my hand. The bold headline detailed the final total collapse of Blake Commercial Properties. Douglas Blake had faced the federal auditors without the protection of his expensive lawyers or his corrupt board of directors. The relentless investigation had uncovered decades of systemic corporate fraud, predatory lending, and blatant embezzlement. Douglas was completely ruined. He was stripped of his tailored charcoal suits and his lavish corner office. The article noted that the federal judge had shown absolutely no leniency during the sentencing hearing. Douglas Blake was currently residing in a federal penitentiary, serving a mandatory 15-year sentence. The arrogant man who had mocked my denim jacket and threatened to leave me working a cash register was now wearing an issued uniform and eating his meals off a dented metal tray. He could no longer order people around or threaten their livelihoods. He was just a number in a massive system, a broken man forced to reckon with the total devastation of his own vanity. His elite country club memberships were permanently revoked. His high society friends had entirely abandoned him, erasing his name from their exclusive social registries, as if he had never existed. He was a ghost, trapped in a concrete cage, left with nothing but the crushing weight of his own monumental failure. I continued reading, moving my eyes down the long column of printed text. The collateral damage of the Blake family downfall was absolute. Vanessa was prominently featured in a secondary paragraph detailing the swift federal seizure of her personal assets. The government had confiscated her designer wardrobe, her imported jewelry, and the luxury vehicles she believed she was inherently entitled to. Her bank accounts were permanently frozen. The offshore funds she had so desperately tried to hack on that final day were completely secured out of her reach. The article reported that Vanessa had narrowly avoided federal prison time by fully cooperating with the authorities and forfeiting every single dime she possessed. She was completely bankrupt. The woman who had thrown a heavy crystal vase at my head and demanded a $200,000 severance package for wasting her time was now entirely destitute. A small handwritten note from Winston confirmed that Vanessa was currently renting a tiny dilapidated apartment in a decaying part of the city. She was working a minimum-wage retail job at a discount clothing store. She spent her long days folding cheap garments and answering to the very working-class people she used to treat like disposable trash. The people she used to actively mock were now her shift managers. She had to force a smile and apologize to angry customers who yelled at her over expired coupons. Every single day was a grueling, painful reminder of the massive fortune she had so arrogantly thrown away. The universe had forced her into the exact life she had always despised. She was finally learning the bitter, awful taste of a life without unearned privilege. I reached the final section of the newspaper clipping. It was the only part of the article that truly mattered to me. It detailed the fate of my former son. When Connor signed the disinheritance document in the county jail, I kept my word. I contacted the federal prosecutors and formally dropped the grand larceny and corporate forgery charges. I removed the dark looming threat of a 20-year sentence in a maximum security facility. Without my active cooperation, the federal case collapsed entirely. Connor was handed over to the local state authorities to face charges for the minor consumer theft and the initial physical breach of my private property. He was convicted and served his short time in a local county facility. The handwritten note from Winston confirmed that Connor had been officially released on strict probation exactly 2 weeks ago. He had walked out of the county jail with nothing but the cheap clothes on his back. He had no penthouse to return to. He had no offshore trust fund to drain. The high society elite had completely cast him out the moment his fabricated wealth evaporated into the air. He was entirely alone. Winston reported that Connor had finally secured employment to satisfy the rigid requirements of his parole officer. He was working at a large chain grocery store on the harsh outskirts of the city. His primary duty was pushing heavy metal shopping carts across the sprawling, uneven asphalt parking lot. He had to wear a cheap polyester uniform shirt and a plastic name tag. He had to dodge speeding cars in the lot and endure the endless physical exhaustion of manual labor. He spent his long days gathering the scattered carts in the freezing rain and the blistering sun. He was forced to look at the callous disregard of the wealthy customers who ignored him completely, just as he had once ignored the hardworking people who had built my company. I stared at the words printed on the page. Connor was doing exactly what Evelyn had always wanted him to do. He was finally working a grueling physical job for a meager paycheck. He was feeling the deep, agonizing ache in his muscles and the biting, freezing cold on his bare hands. He was learning the profound, deep humility of physical labor. He was learning what it actually took to survive in the real demanding world without a father to blindly fund his toxic illusions. I did not feel a single ounce of sadness. I did not feel any lingering anger or vindictive joy. I felt only the deep, quiet, overwhelming satisfaction of a successfully completed task. The massive ledger was finally perfectly balanced. The vast wealth that Connor and Vanessa had tried so desperately to steal had been permanently redistributed to the warehouse staff and the veteran truck drivers who had actually earned it with their own sweat. The arrogant people who thought they were vastly superior were now scrubbing floors and pushing metal carts, while the people they looked down upon were thriving as legitimate business owners. The ultimate poetic justice had been served without a single shot ever being fired. I carefully folded the newspaper clipping in half. I folded it again and again until it was a small, thick square of paper. I stood up from the wooden steps and walked slowly over to the stone fire pit burning brightly in the center of the yard. I pulled a single wooden match from my denim pocket and struck it against the rough gray stone. The small flame flared bright and hot in the cool air. I held the flame to the corner of the newspaper and watched the fire rapidly consume the ink and the paper. The edges curled and blackened as the intense heat devoured the absolute last physical proof of my former life. I dropped the burning square into the center of the pit. The fire crackled and popped, consuming the dry pine logs and the remnants of the past. The gray ashes floated up into the cold mountain air, disappearing completely into the steady wind. The smoke drifted lazily up toward the massive canopy of the surrounding forest. I walked back to the wooden porch and picked up my heavy ceramic mug of bitter black coffee. I looked out over the pristine, uninterrupted wilderness. The sky above the tree line was a flawless, vibrant blue, entirely untouched by smog or towering skyscrapers. I took a slow, quiet sip of the hot coffee, letting the deep warmth spread entirely through my chest. The natural order had been fully restored. The truest measure of a person is not found in the inheritance they blindly receive, but in the unyielding integrity of the labor they are willing to endure. Wealth, devoid of hardship, breeds a toxic entitlement that rots the soul from the inside out, while true power belongs solely to those who build from the dirt upward. A legacy is never sustained by appeasing the greedy. It is preserved by ruthlessly cutting away the rot to protect the faithful. When deception is met with calculated silence, the ultimate justice is simply forcing the arrogant to live the exact life they always despised. If you found this story compelling, please consider sharing it and subscribing for more narratives about resilience and absolute justice.